There is a lot of reunioning underway because this is in part an ingathering of a lot of old friends and acquaintances and colleagues. And it's a particular treat. I'm Checker Finn with the Fordham Institute. It's a particular treat to wrap up our Education 2020 series. This is the 10th and last session, incidentally, with Bill Bennett. We welcome the live audience in the room. We welcome the worldwide audience that's watching the live stream and will, after today, watch more of it or watch it again and again and again. This is a better size live audience than we've had for a couple of our sessions. Mike Petrilli reminded me that our very first session with the eminent Heather McDonald had an audience of about 3 because it turned out it was the same day as the Kavanaugh hearing. And that turned out to be a tough competition. So I don't know what's going on the Hill today, Dr. Bennett, but it seems to have released a good number of people to indictments, subpoenas, the usual, you mean. This set of papers and talks and authors has turned out to be really quite remarkable. There are 18 first-rate papers across a host of issues pertinent to where American education should be heading, with an introduction and conclusion by Mike Petrilli and myself and a preface by Senator Lamar Alexander. These will come out as a single volume in February, just in time for the primaries, by the way, from Templeton Press. I've been going over the edits for most of them myself the last couple weeks, and it's really quite a collection by some remarkable thinkers. So today is the finale, and it's a treat for me. My own relationship with Bill Bennett goes back almost 40 years now. Colleague, friend, a mentor, occasional sparring partner, hiking buddy, more things than you can think of. He's been much improved by Elaine Bennett, who's with us today as well. And they've become the sort of friends that, like where you want to know how their kids are doing too, that kind of friend, which isn't true of everybody that you claim to be a friend in Washington these days. Theirs are doing very well indeed, by the way. His resume is in front of you, at least the very short version of it is, and so I'm not going to attempt to biograph him. Some things it doesn't tell you, however, such as the fact that he's no ivory tower policy wonk or sit in the office education secretary. He's been to visit and in most cases spend serious time in, often teaching in something like 600 schools around the country. Is that about right?
Yeah.
The resume also doesn't do justice to all his books. Most recently, preparation of a 1-volume edition of his really first-rate U.S. history book entitled America, The Last Best Hope. The 1-volume edition will be out in the fall and would be a fantastic textbook for any serious knowledge-centric U.S. history course in high school or in college. His talk today is a fitting capstone. As you will hear, it ranges across several key issues, but ends up centering on knowledge, indeed the centrality of knowledge in any serious education. This is not a new thing for Bill. If you go back to the Education Department publications that he authored 3 decades ago when we were working together at the Department of Education, and you will find things like James Madison Elementary School and James Madison High School actually spelling out what, in his opinion, a curriculum should consist of. He wasn't trying to make anybody do it. He's well aware of the appropriate limits of the federal government. But the limits on advice aren't as severe as the limits on government action. You'll also find, if you go back online, I think you can still find it, this little book called First Lessons, a report on elementary education in America. 1986, William J. Bennett, U.S. Secretary of Education. This was just 1 year into his time at the department, a review of the state of elementary education in America today. One of its sort of team members that helped us think it through is here in the audience today, and it's very nice to see Francie as well. I just want to take you to 2 paragraphs on page 20 as I re-examined this volume today to sort of, again, 33 years ago. Keep this in mind. American children do seem to be getting better at basic skills, reading, writing, and computation. Yet when asked to begin applying these skills to the acquisition of more complex knowledge, usually around fourth grade, many begin to falter. In a number of curriculum areas, international comparisons have found students in our later elementary grades failing to hold their own against students in other countries. These outcomes suggest that from the earliest grades, our elementary schools should be doing more, not just teaching children how to add and subtract, how to write the alphabet and fill in worksheets, but also encouraging them to solve problems, to think critically, to acquire knowledge, and to organize disparate kinds of information. 33 years ago. So as Bill takes the stage, takes the chair, we will hear whether anything's gotten better in 33 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Checker, dear friend, colleague, true friend. Delighted to be with you all to revisit some matters. You'll excuse me for sitting down because one thing since 1986, my knees have gotten worse, my hair's gotten whiter, and I need glasses to read. You remember George Washington when he was trying to keep his men from marching on the Congress to get their money. Not necessarily a bad idea to have an army march on Congress occasionally, but I don't recommend it. But he pulled out a piece of paper that he had written a note on, and then he pulled out his glasses, and he heard the hush of the crowd, and he said, gentlemen, I see you are surprised that I'm wearing spectacles, but I have become not only gray, but almost blind in the service of my country. My excuse is just old age, just aging, just been around a while. But we're still kicking and still talking, still trying to get in the game. Boy, I have friends who are watching, who watch this thing in Washington. They say, you people just can't stop being Washington, no matter how hard you try. You were in it 3 sentences, and you'd mention Kavanaugh, the Hill, and the primaries. You know, it is kind of a company town. It's kind of a company town here, but it is the most interesting city and the most powerful city in the world, and it's really a lot of fun to be here. I want to thank Checker, Mike Petrilli. I want to thank Hoover. This is Hoover's digs, not Fordham's.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
they're better digs.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say. I just, remember my last visit to Fordham, and this isn't it. No, it's perfectly fine. I'd come anytime you ask me. Okay, my wife's scowling at me, so get to the point. Anyway, thanks very much, and it is a pleasure. I want to thank colleagues Karen Nussel. Where's Karen? Right there, my boss at Conservative Leaders for Education. Also there, Emily Grimm is on the staff, and Christopher Moorman, who helped me through about 11 drafts of the paper, which you will have. That's not that. We have a real paper for you, but this is how I prepare to talk. As Elaine says, how do I do that? I don't know. I just have to do it. I saw somebody deliver a paper from an iPhone the other day. Is that rude? I think that's rude. Anyway, we don't allow it at the table. In addition, though, I want to thank our colleagues at Conservative Leaders for Education. We work with state legislators, and this has been a real eye-opener for me. Another place where the rubber hits the road, state legislators, and getting their perspective and their insight. And we sent them drafts of this paper. And I want to thank Luther Olson from Wisconsin, Mike Wilson from Kentucky, Peggy Lehner from Ohio, Mike Beleka from Florida, and Jennifer Sullivan, who succeeded Mike as chairman of the House Education Committee. John Eichelberger in Pennsylvania, we went up and testified there right after the Janus decision. And Amy Sinclair out of Iowa, the Senate Education Chair. They all made helpful comments, and we kind of test what we come up with at Conservative Leaders for Education by asking at the end of a session, what would Amy Sinclair in Iowa say about this recommendation? Test it for reality, and that's a good idea. The purpose of this series was to answer the question, what is a sound conservative vision of education, but to do so by first answering the primary question, what is the purpose of education? In around 1985, I heard a statement, I've read a million of them, written a few myself, but I never improved on Patricia Elberg Graham, then the dean of the Harvard School of Education, and it's not that often that I quote the Harvard School of Education, but when Marty West got there, it improved. Anyway, there are some good people there. But Dean Graham said the purpose of education is to nurture and enhance the wit and character of the young. I think that's just right, just exactly right, if we could do it. Conservative consensus. There was at one time a fairly broad consensus among conservatives and shared by a number of liberals on a few things. I tried to capture that, not original thoughts to me, maybe original phrasing, but when I was Secretary of Education, by talking about the 3 C's, content, choice, and character. There was a conservative consensus building about choice, and then there were wars about choice. A lot of those wars were resolved by an armistice in which public school choice would be acceptable for large parts of the education world, but not private school choice. A lot of this went to the courts as well. But the idea of choice, that parents should be able to choose the schools of their children that their children should attend, is a big and powerful idea and was one of the major ideas in this conservative consensus. And it's still a strong idea and still favored by many. And indeed, I noticed the Department of Education leads with this idea. It's a powerful notion, and it's very much tied to our ideas of freedom. But it requires certain things. First of all, it's procedure. It requires adults who care enough to make the choice, to make the decision, and to get involved, both in the choice of schools and in participation. It's also a means to an end. It's not the end. You hope when you get there you get a better product, but it's the getting there that choice emphasizes. There's also problems in rural areas of America, as you know, with choice. And I think the main objection to choice, it's not an objection to the idea of choice, just the reality of choice, is that 4 out of every 5 kids in America will attend a traditional neighborhood school. And that's just the way it is. So as I used to say all the time to the private school people, when we talk to them, I care a lot about what you do. I care a lot about what homeschoolers do. But we got to care about what's going on in all these schools, because it may not be your kids, but they're going to be the kids who your kids work for or employ or live with or are neighbors. So let's try to fix things. Anyway, that was part of the consensus. Also, the notion of accountability. And accountability pretty much became assessment and tests and standards. Fine for accountability. I'm for it. I was all for it. But we kind of had a mess there because we created too many. I'm doing this very quickly, and I know I'm glossing over a lot, but I just want to lay it all out. But we ended up with too many tests, lots of complaints about the tests, lots of tests that weren't very good. As far as I'm concerned, there's just one great supreme test, and it won't work for a lot of things, and that's the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which I think has maintained its standards, its integrity. It hasn't dumbed down. But there are some tests that are better than others. Anyway, I think accountability was part of that, and content was part of that. That is, there should be a sound educational content for every child. That was in some ways previewed by the Nation at Risk report, which preceded me by a couple of years. Secretary Bell did that with his committee, and they laid out, some very strong requirements, or so we thought. 4 years of math and 3 years of science, as I remember. But they left something out. They didn't say what should be in that math, what should be in that science. So people put in seat time in math or science, but maybe senior year they were getting to Algebra 2, and we should be doing better than that. But there was this rough consensus about choice and about content and about accountability. There is no consensus anymore. And my evidence for this, not to be mean, is the 18 papers that you've had before. Some brilliant stuff and some stuff that's relevant to education, but not very much in the way of a conservative vision of education. That's one piece of evidence. The other piece of evidence is, where is it, or what is it, or where would one find it? I think you could find it at Fordham. I think you could find it at Hoover. But in terms of practice and in general circulation, I don't think there is a vision. So I'm going to try to propose one, picking up on choice and accountability and adding some things to it. All right, well, what about liberals? After all, they're half the world, aren't they? Yes, they are. And at least 24 of them are. Anyway, whatever, last count. There I go again, Washington. In short, I'm not sure liberals are interested in education anymore. Rick Hess said, some question as to whether it's all about social justice and social equity. I was reading in this, and the more I read, the more I became convinced that this is now the focus of the left when it comes to education. And I'm for equity, and I'm for equal treatment, and I'm for, paying people, good salary for work and equal pay for equal work, all things considered. But, what about reading and writing and arithmetic? Now, this was foreshadowed or not foreshadowed, I am foreshadowing an article, I guess it's out already in Atlantic, this next issue of Atlantic. Have you heard about this article? It's called the Problem with Educationism. And this is some very wealthy liberal donor, and there have been a lot of liberal donors giving a lot of money to education, who says, we've been taken in. We've forked over all these millions or billions, and it's all about education. And that's not where the action is. We got to work on minimum wage, and we got to work on basically the liberal Democrat agenda. I mean, and you can have a liberal Democrat agenda. The problem is it's not an education agenda. I remember when, the battle in curriculum between conservatives and liberals was whether it was, to use one of your really brilliant papers, Yuval Levin's paper, where conservatives said, start American history with a sense of gratitude. I think that was his phrase. And liberals said, no, start American history with a sense of outrage. And that was the battle. But in some ways, conservatives have not developed a vision, and liberals, to a great extent, have left the field. I was reading a lot about suspensions and talking to Mrs. Bennett about it, and she works in the inner city schools. And a lot of schools have decided their main job is to bring suspensions down, number of suspensions down, even if by keeping kids who should be suspended in the classroom, scores go down. It's a balancing act. I just don't think that makes sense. On suspensions, by the way, I'm persuaded by Mrs. Bennett that out-of-school suspensions don't make sense. They go to a worse place, and they get themselves in more trouble. In-school suspension, something like that makes a lot more sense. Don't send them out where they're going to be in likely a worse environment. But, again, the goal of school ought to be to nurture and enhance the wit and character of the young. And, there are all these other things to deal with about issues of social equity, and we should deal with them. But school's about school. I suggest for a conservative vision, we go back to the heart of the enterprise, which is content. I am a Hirsch guy, University of Virginia. I'm a Willingham guy, University of Virginia. I'm a Steiner and Berner guy, Johns Hopkins. Knowledge matters. I am convinced that knowledge matters. Most of the people I know who I listen to know a lot of stuff and read a lot of stuff. And it was interesting to me before I became Sec of Ed to be at the National Endowment for the Humanities, and I sent out a survey to 150 conservative and liberal thinkers, writers, about evenly divided. What are the 5 books everybody should read by the time they finish high school? The remarkable thing was the consensus, left and right. I don't know if you'd have it today, but what's number 1? Bible. Second was founding documents of America, Federalist Papers, Declaration of Independence, Emancipation Proclamation, founding and defining. Shakespeare. 3, I'm not sure I have the order all right here. 4th was the Odyssey, the Iliad and the Odyssey, kind of surprised, but good for them. And 5th was the great American novel, which is? Huck Finn. That's it. Finn. Oh, any relation? Spend any time on that raft, have you? Yeah, all right. Good for you, Huck Finn. Yeah, you should know that. Anyway, those are all books that are very rich in content, wouldn't you say? And all these very smart and accomplished people have read them. I don't suggest that proves it, but I do think it's suggestive. Came about, I don't know exactly when, someone in this room will know, that a big popular saying in education became, you have to learn how to learn. And I'm all in favor of learning how to learn, but I am convinced that you learn how to learn by learning something. And this, I think, is the great insight of Hirsch and Willingham and all those other smart guys at the University of Virginia, though it pains me to say it because our sons were rivals in sports at the University of Virginia. Anyway, but so be it. Knowledge matters. And with knowledge and with reading comes the ability to connect in your mind disparate things, disparate subjects. Dig into almost anything that pays a return as a child and read about it. For me, it was reptiles and amphibians, much to the chagrin of my mother, because then I wanted to bring them home too. But dig in and read, and that will make a big difference. The other thing reading does is another thing that turns out to be a huge predictor of success in college and life, and that's vocabulary. It gives you vocabulary. You learn what words mean. I don't want to cite these studies. They're all over the place about the vocabulary advantage that kids who have parents read to them bring to school. The numbers are staggering. You know, if you read a book a day, if you read 2 books a day, if you read 3 books a day, the advantage is enormous. One understands, I've always understood this, agreed, with Socrates when, you know, he sets up the ideal state. If you really want equality of opportunity, take them all away from their parents, because there's unequal opportunity being distributed every day by parents, some who read and some who don't. Some will give them vocabulary and some will stick them in front of the tube. And that's a big deal. So it is all the more incumbent, it seems to me, if we're interested in equity, which we should be, that schools help in that background knowledge, help in that compensation, so that children will read there and read when they go home to get that background knowledge. Choice is important. Accountability is important. But one's about getting there. The other is about measuring at the end. Content, I submit, is at the heart, is the substance of education. Now, one of the reasons that content got a bad name is that somebody came up with the idea of a common core of learning. I think it was me. I should say I think it was I. There's the giveaway right there, isn't it? Yeah, anyway, I think it was I. I was one of them anyway. Hirsch said I was. Because I said there should be, and we said in all those little books that we wrote, Checker, these are the things we think you should read. Now, some very conservative people got upset with us recommending a list of books, saying next it'll be a mandate. I've often thought if I could mandate Shakespeare in the Federalist Papers, maybe I would have. But no, I'm for limited government. Let them choose it on their own. But the problem was common learning became common core. Common core became something that wasn't the common core, became all sorts of things. I ended up with a different hat on later in life as a radio host, and half the calls I got were from outraged conservative parents saying, my child is reading the Quran because it's part of the common core, and other such things. Then there was this notion that it was a good thing to be in favor of something called the Common Core in order to get federal funding, that it was either a mandate or a sort of a mandate or at least a good idea. I'm afraid what happened here was a baby in bathwater, is that common learning, which is still critical if we want to be one country, if we want to talk about the unum as well as the pluribus. Too much pluribus these days, I think, not enough unum, but that's another story. We could have both and should have both, is that we lost the sense of a common core of knowledge, ideas, books, notions that we could share. How about those 5? How about those 5 books as a starter? Doesn't The Savage in Brave New World, doesn't he just have Shakespeare? That guy they find who has not been programmed all the way through. And he found some here, a set of Shakespeare, and that's his entire learning. Lincoln said 2 books. I've read only 2 books, Bible and Shakespeare. Anyway, pretty good curriculum. I'm not recommending, I'm not requiring, I'm not recommending. I am recommending, I'm not requiring. All right. Anyway, certain things come out of a commitment to content, which have been summarized very well by a couple people. One, Robert Pondicio, who's in the audience, he says, the last best educational lever left unpulled is content. Steiner and Berner at Johns Hopkins point out it's a valuable one, it's a neglected one, and it's an inexpensive one. It's just as it's cheaper, frankly, to have good content than to have many of the things that we do in schools and spend a lot of money on. Let me summarize the Berner and Steiner comments from their summary. Do not think skills can be taught independent of knowledge. Do not back away from their demand for robust, comprehensive standards. Do not allow any of the always developing new skill-based fads distract from the focus on content. Don't allow the unintended consequence of testing on reading, writing, and math to crowd out other critical content and knowledge. Do not seek federal mandates of what states and schools should do on content. Do not think that content is not central to every educational endeavor. I guess one would add career and technical education as well. At least I would. So I suggest that be at the heart of it. we have the technology and the know-how and the experience to develop good tests and good assessments. We proved that with NAEP, and there are some other good ones. Choice should remain an issue we have and fight for. And I think choice, by the way, in the teaching profession, the Janus decision is a good thing. And my real hope, as we at Conservative Leaders for Education set up in Pennsylvania, we testified, is that quite apart from giving teachers freedom, I hope it gives them an opportunity to think for themselves and perhaps become a more professional group than many of them have become over the past. I love the teachers, but there's a group think in those teachers' unions, I think, that has been destructive of a lot of their creativity and imagination. And I'm hoping this opportunity for them to step out of those requirements that the Janus decision brought will bring, hopefully bring that back. Now, I'm not the first one to talk about content. I mentioned the scholars who've done this. Other people have done it. Most of the time in our history, we have emphasized this. But what goes wrong? A lot goes wrong. The main thing I think that goes wrong in education is we're looking for the shiny object. We're looking for the new thing, the new silver bullet. This is the thing that'll fix it. I realized when I was Secretary of Education that the word innovative was a synonym for good, and traditional was a synonym for bad. I'm not for everything we've done traditionally, but a thing is either good or bad, and it may be good if it's traditional, it may be bad if it's traditional, it may be good if it's innovative, it may be terrible if it's innovative. Remember the big thing about professional development for teachers, teacher training, professional development? I was for it, and I was for it at the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we had something called summer seminars for journalists in the great books like Dante and others. And I took them away from the journalists because they were already on a bad road. Anyway, I'm kidding. But I just thought teachers would be more deserving. So we made it summer seminars in content, big books, important books taught by great scholars for elementary and middle school teachers. That I think was worthwhile. I got to believe it was worthwhile. I don't think we did any studies, but it was Tom Kane, I think, not the governor, but is it Tom Kane at Harvard, who went through this huge study on what's the phrase I'm looking for, professional development? Yeah, and found out that this is a huge waste of money. Really, it's basically a huge waste of money. You get more credentials, I guess you get another thing, and maybe you get a raise, but in terms of learning, it doesn't make much. So, again, the idea is not original to me. I just think we need to bring it back. George Orwell says sometimes the first responsibility of intelligent people is a restatement of the obvious. And I think we've missed the obvious in a lot of schools. And I have been to a lot of schools where I have sat for 2 or 3 hours and not heard any content. I've heard, what's your opinion, and what do you think, and how do you feel about that? And, who's Virgil talking about? What about that? Anyway. But politics enters in, and that can be part of the problem, too, because that can push the fads, because we know there are powerful interests in the education world that push the parties around, more influence in the Democrat Party than the Republican Party, but influence there, too. Somebody told me that when the Democrat convention gets together, 35% of the people who are there will be either members of a teachers union or married to a member of a teachers union. I don't know if it's 35%, but that's big. That's power. John Adams said, liberty, when men act in bodies, is power. And so, if something comes along that unions like, they're going to push it. And maybe we don't do the inquiry enough about whether it makes sense or not. But politics can also work sometimes. It really can. And I just, not to have people think this is really original to me, I just want to point out that we had, in the history of this country, I'm sure we've had more than one, but we had one great example, one shining example, not shine a silver bullet, but not shiny object, but shining example of getting it right. And pinpointing as close as I can based on my reading and research, it was Massachusetts from 1997 to 2003. It mandated excellent content. It created at least some public school choices. It mandated an excellent test, the MCAS. I think it was a pretty good test at the time. and create an extra test for teachers to be sure they were qualified. Somebody may want to ask me about the latest results on the elementary school teacher qualifications. That's what it did. One of the most liberal states in the country, and this was done largely by the hands of liberals, but it was, by my view, if I can call it that, a conservative view of education. Or how about, we don't call it a liberal or a conservative, just a very sound view of education. Why do I say it was sound? You all know this. If Massachusetts had been a country, it would have been 10th in the world by its scores. And think what it did for equity for those kids at all levels. One of our state senators, Luther Olson from Wisconsin, read this paper and said, "You need to mention stick-to-itness." And I said, "You mean stick-to-itiveness?" He said, "No, stick-to-itness." That's what they do call it in Wisconsin. Fair enough. He said, when you got something that's working, stay with it. Checker can recall his writing better than I, but Checker pointed out that Massachusetts kind of fell off this a little bit, partly because of politics, I think, and other reasons. But it's very important that it happened. Who were the people? Bill Weld, who was then the governor, he appointed his opponent in the governor's race, John Silber, to chair the commission. Very generous of Bill Weld. Bill Weld's a brilliant guy, very funny guy too. He saw him on TV the other day. He's challenging Donald Trump for the nomination. And the guy said, "How you doing?" He said, "I'm at 1%. The guy said, 1%? He said, "I'm number 2. I'm second." That's better than 20 of those Democrats. You know, I'm number 2. Anyway, he's a very smart guy, and he appointed Silber. Getting it through the Senate was Tom Birmingham, a very liberal Democrat, still is. Marshaling this thing and muscling it through the House was the Speaker, Joe Finneran. I love these names, Boston. And David Driscoll, we all know. I think he's part of the operation at Fordham still, and others. And they got it done. I should say something because there's a personal connection I have. When Weld was running for governor and Silber was running, Silber had been my teacher at the University of Texas. I worked for him at Boston University. I had a speech up in Springfield, Massachusetts, and Silber heard about it, and actually we were debating. And he said, "You know, I'm running for governor." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Are you going to support me?" I said, "John, I owe you a lot. You want me to support you or oppose you? Tell me what you want me to do." He said, "It'd be more helpful if you oppose me." I said, "Okay." He said, "You're not exactly Massachusetts stuff up here." I said, so I opposed him. And Weld won. I guess I carried more weight than he thought. Anyway, that was my teacher. Tom Birmingham, very left, very liberal guy in the Senate, was my student at Harvard. I'm not saying I had some hand in it. I just had a connection. You know, I know those guys, and they did this, and it was quite a remarkable thing. There's some other states that are doing good things too. I don't mean to just talk about Massachusetts. Louisiana, I think, has embarked on some very interesting work now, and a lot of it having to do with content, and good for them. And I should watch it more closely than I do, but I give them a lot of credit for trying a lot of things and hitting the right notes, emphasizing in the right places. Florida, as Mike Petrilli reminds us, has done remarkably well with a pretty steady budget. But I don't think it's been particularly strong on content, at least not according to the two House chairs that I know there. Let me end with this part with quoting again Steiner and Berner from Johns Hopkins. Improvements in content and curriculum are probably the most effective basis. Probably the most effective change that we can do in education. And they suggest the following, among other things. Review and rethink the role of state. You want me to stop?
Well, finish your thought.
Okay. I got 2 minutes, okay?
Yes.
Review and rethink the role of the state and state funds in both teacher ed and professional development geared to content. Develop better accountability systems that encourage strong content-based learning. Review teacher education to be sure that teacher education focuses on teachers having subject matter knowledge. Let me abbreviate the rest of it. Let me end on this. Is there a viable conservative vision in education? Yes, there is. I think this what we've been describing is the heart of it. I think Massachusetts is a great example. Even better than a conservative vision of education, it's a vision of education that conservatives and liberals can agree on in theory, because they actually did it once in practice. I mentioned that John Silber was my teacher. I took 3 courses in Immanuel Kant from him. The philosopher David Hume asked, is knowledge possible? Kant said, ist Wissen möglich? And you have it. He answered, it's possible because it's actual. Ja, Wissen ist echt. Knowledge is possible because it's actual. We actually know something. So is it possible to have schools that do it right? And is it possible, even politically, to get it right? Yes, it's possible because we did it. We did it once. We maybe lost it, but we can do it again. And at least a number of states and state legislators and others are about, and think tanks, smart people in think tanks, are trying to get it done again. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're very, very welcome. How'd I do without you writing it?
Could have been better.
With Huck Finn, yeah.
A very, very brief Bill Weld anecdote. He lived across the hall from me for 2 years in Adam's house on the same floor, and he was never seen to study, but he graduated summa in classics. So he is indeed a smart guy.
Very smart guy.
And there was some point at which he may have studied. Anyway, you are famous for choice, content, and character. You talked the least today about character.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a word or two? A lot of our other writers, speakers have written quite a lot about bringing back character education in some form to American education as a kind of fundamental. Do you want to say a little bit about character, which didn't seem to be at the top of today's agenda?
I'll say a couple things, sure. Again, the definition, wit and character of the young. Then I did my PhD in philosophy, moral philosophy. I don't think you teach character. If you taught character and you have better character from teaching it, philosophy departments would have the finest people in them. I know them. I'll take the engineers overall. They're fine. Some are fine, but you don't get better just by hanging out with the material. Okay. Second, I didn't want a course in it because somebody told me in one of my trips to a school that they had a course in ethics, but everybody was cheating. It's like the woman who brought 20 copies of the Book of Virtues, and she said somebody stole 10 of them out of my car. I said, let's see if it works. See if they bring them back. It's to understand the exercise wrong. And in this, there was an intense period of, I wrote an article called Getting Ethics, in which people in corporations would sponsor retreats for a week, and you'd go and get ethics. That's not the way it works. You grow up with rules, with precepts set by your parents, your teachers, your coaches, and example. And there's nothing quite like the power of example. So it has no particular place in the curriculum for me, except when you're doing literature, it's not bad to read these stories of good character. I was reading about Alistair McIntyre, the professor. Elaine and I were binging on Jane Austen movies this weekend. And he said, who's the best character in Jane Austen? Fanny Price. We could have a discussion of that because she holds to her character. So, okay, read that, and you can talk about Fanny Price's character. I did the Book of Virtues checker because teachers I was visiting with when I was secretary said, how do we teach these kids values, right from wrong? And we have kids from, 30 different ethnic backgrounds. I said, do any of the boys like to be bullied? Do any of the girls like to be touched when they don't want anybody to touch them? Does anybody like to have their lunch money stolen? There are some moral basics, and that's what the Book of Virtues was about. That's not teaching character. That's teaching a kind of recognition. Mm-hmm. And you can understand it and still, wrong. So there's no place in the curriculum. But there is a place in schools, and I'm maybe going too much here, but I was looking at Mrs. Bennett's signs that she brought to, where were you yesterday? Aton Elementary with 100 fourth graders. And the signs they read, this is pretty good, that Mrs. Bennett brought in was, the best thing to do is to find an adult who will listen. There are adults here in this room who will listen to you at school. They are your social workers, your counselors, your teachers. You can tell your friend or family member about this number if you think he or she needs help, and then a number's listed. This is moral education in our time, because these kids are subject to things,
Bad stuff.
worse stuff than the 80s. And she also had, remember what you send in a text will last forever. Is it Aristotelian, Nicomachean ethics? No, not exactly. But one thing that I think Mrs. Bennett would give me credit for is we were talking about Aristotle one day, and I said something, and she wrote it down, and that's in the sign in the room, too. Aristotle talked about 3 kinds of friends. You have friends who give you pleasure, friends who are useful to you, and the most important kind of friendship is the friend who helps you become a better human being. Excellence as a person, excellence as a man or woman, as Aristotle puts it. And that's one of the signs up too. So there's time for such things. It's an after-school program. And do the kids need it? Yeah, and they need it at a very basic level. Probably what a lot of these kids need more than anything else is just that message that there's somebody here who will help you if you want to talk.
Yeah.
Because they're facing a lot of stuff.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to switch back to content because content gets close to curriculum, and I don't think you actually used the word curriculum, but you did talk in your paper about a, quote, robust set of shared knowledge, which comes close to curriculum. And these days, many conservatives yell and scream at the very suggestion that there is a prescribed curriculum of any kind of central prescribed curriculum. Have we lost the possibility of getting conservative support for curriculum like the Steiner recommendations that you were quoting?
I don't think we've lost it. I just, you cannot mandate it. I mean, I referenced this in my talk, that when we put out these what works, and even worse, James Madison Elementary School, and James Madison High School,
right,
and maybe worse yet, a book that you and I did with John Cribb called The Educated Child. I wasn't in office then, you weren't in office, but we said, here's what the little buggers ought to read, you know? You shouldn't get through 4th grade without knowing these things. And that was pretty prescriptive.
It had a lot to do with the Hirsch curriculum, too, actually.
But we weren't anybody.
Yeah,
you know, we were just guys writing a book. I think it has to come from the ground up, but it can come with strong recommendations. And, you know, we got to draw on this heritage. And I do think we can tilt as Americans and as citizens and as educators toward those things which unite us. The pluribus unum. Lots to talk about the pluribus, and that's fine. We're diverse, and we can have diverse day and Italian day and whatever other day we want. But we got to talk about the things we have in common, because we are a unique and very special country with a very special set of beliefs and values.
But come back to your colleagues who are legislators.
Okay.
I'm also showing the scars from my own time on a state board of education. What can a state official do without mandating to cause any of these things to occur?
Well, I'm more comfortable on the state level, closer.
Fair enough.
And I think what a state can do is say you got to go further than with the nation at risk, right? 4 years of math, 3 years of history. You have to say should be familiar with the following concepts, facts, ideas, and dates, right?
Okay.
So you don't get fake. I was going to say fake news. So you don't get fake history. You get real history. Should be familiar with the following words and works and ideas. Then, districts have to apply it, but states can do that. Look, I think part of this, are we recovered from the Common Core thing? Is that war over?
I think it's worn over unless somebody tries to restart it.
Right. But I mean, when you started this question by saying conservatives are still very wary. Not now, not with this crowd, right?
Well, not this crowd.
No, Betsy. Secretary DeVos, President Trump. There's no prescribed curriculum coming out.
I don't think they're paying any attention to this whole issue of content and stuff like that, actually.
Not much.
And I would like it if more states did it, but when I look at Fordham, for example, spent a lot of time reviewing state academic standards in all the core subjects, and mostly they suck. And when they don't, the outcomes, the scores suck, which is to say the standards may look good, but the implementation of them is not producing much of a result. Now, there are exceptions. You've cited several state exceptions, including the Massachusetts miracle and good things underway right now in Louisiana,
Yes,
and so on,
right.
all of which give me some hope. But the generality is standards that aren't very good and outcomes that are worse. So I'm worried about essentially who can make any of this happen. I guess that's what it comes down to.
Well, it can't be a king. I mean, we don't do that anymore. And it can't be, prescribed by the federal government or probably by a governor. But you can have it out. You can have a fight on this, and you can have different stuff
Yeah.
going on in different states. But if we're all Americans, there has to be some commonality of understanding. I think you slug it out because you can't take politics out of this. And so you go and you serve on a Maryland state board. And if you were Catholic, you would go right to heaven because you've already been through purgatory. I tell people who serve on school boards at any level, you've already been through purgatory. But it's just a matter of slugging it. Well, don't you think they should be familiar with the Federalist Papers? Don't you think they should read some great novels? Don't you think they should have some idea of what the Greeks gave us? Don't you think they should know Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech? Don't you, a list?
Well, I didn't
And
know
then fight it
purgatory
out.
was going to last 4 years, but I guess it sometimes does.
Oh,
No,
Oh, you don't know about purgatory. Oh,
all right, I'm not
the
going
nuns
to.
told us thousands and thousands of years, and that's even after you've cleaned up your act. Oh my God.
Heaven can wait, I guess. Okay. I'm not disagreeing at all. I am.
What was your curriculum experience? I mean, did you guys ever talk about curriculum?
Yeah, we talked about standards all the time. The state doesn't mandate a curriculum. We talked about standards, and I looked at the social studies standards, for example, that being near and dear to my heart, and they sucked. And they still do. And when we tried to do anything about it, we were told that the social studies supervisors of the 24 districts in Maryland like them the way they are. What business has this amateur bunch in the state board to do with changing that? In other words, it's not just politics, actually. It's also sort of the the blob, as you once dubbed it. And the status quo-ism of the education field when it comes to what they're accustomed to teaching.
Leadership. The one thing that you see in Louisiana is John White,
Yeah.
his name, and you saw in Massachusetts was this incredible, strong leadership. And, by Weld and by Silber and by...
And their
by
successors
Driscoll,
for about
right?
20 years.
And
The stick-to-itness.
And the Speaker of the House, this Powell, I guess, who went to jail for a while and then had a radio show. I guess that's what happens. Anyway, sometimes. But Joe Finneran. Well, why would Joe Finneran care about these MCAS? Well, you know what? Joe Finneran went to Boston Latin.
Uh-huh.
He had a good education. When you've had one, you know what it means. And I ended this paper, the new ending. We have to relearn certain things. By we, I mean the country and educators, so that our kids can relearn it. Wordsworth says, "What we have loved, others will love, but we must teach them how." They don't know. They don't know about this, and in the hands of a good teacher, they will know about it. And that's a case you got to make, and it's going to be maybe easier to make in Louisiana than Maryland. But we thank you for your service,
Well, thank you for that.
and we present you with
Yes, with
Nothing.
some more purgatory, I guess. Has the federal government made things worse because of the reading and math emphasis that continues in the successor to No Child Left Behind? I mean, states are being judged, schools are being judged on their scores in 2 subjects, and occasionally science. Has this made it worse for content?
I'll say this. it's easier to do reading and math than, let's say, history. Remember that attempt?
Yes.
And then you go to war about
Yes.
history, about U.S. history. Look, I was opposed to the creation of the department, and I still think we'd be better off without it. And it was entirely possible to be educated well before we had it. And you could argue that kids were getting a better education. When I got the job, you may remember, there was this debate, and I couldn't be confirmed until Ronald Reagan sent a note to Senator Weicker saying, I won't try to abolish the department. So I had all these questions about it. George Will said, must you exist, which is the George Will way of saying,
Yes.
Fancy way of saying, should there be a Department of Education? He didn't mean me personally, but no, it doesn't have to exist. And, it's done some good things, but, we used to talk about what the department's really basic functions were, and I think the Civil Rights Office was fine, though it often got off on tears and rabbit chases that weren't right. And I think that repository for research and knowledge, what was it, Milt Goldberg's shop with you and others.
It's now called IES.
IES
Yeah.
was very important. But otherwise, over the years, it's caused an awful lot of mischief. And look how it contributed to the Common Core debacle.
It's bigger than the Department of Ed. It's also Congress. It was, in that case, the White House. It was a whole lot of things going on that had to do with the federal role writ large.
Well, let me say one more thing. When I got the job, I thought I was the Secretary of Education, and it was Elaine told me to go to school and teach. I remember I said, Elaine, I'm the Secretary of Education. I don't do retail. I do wholesale. And she, the daughter of a successful businessman, said, do good retail and you'll do better wholesale. So 120 schools later. And then I visited 110 schools when I was drug czar, because unfortunately there was too much overlap between education and drug czar job in those days. But it would have been better off, I think, without the department overall. But when I got the job, I thought it was about education. But then when the 273 groups in Washington came to see me, I realized they thought I was the Secretary of Treasury for Education. They didn't care. They didn't care about any of this stuff. They just wanted money. What do you like? What is Bennett like? Oh, we'll do that. Shakespeare. We'll do some Shakespeare. And we'll get the money. They were like some of these textbook publishers. Excuse the expression, Franny.
All right. But we're not, unfortunately, going to undo a federal role
no,
at this point.
It's going to exist.
It's going to exist.
But I do think that, what's the abbreviation, ESSA?
Yeah.
Sending things back to the states is, I think, great, and I think it's real. And that's was one of the main impetus, was it not, Karen, for us, conservative leaders for education. It's going back to the states. We sent out this mailing and had these meetings and said, you guys have the ball, or at least part of the ball. Run with it now. No, don't look to the federal government for mandates. Run with it. And one of the great things that CL4E has done, it seems to me, is we've become a kind of clearinghouse for people, and they've got to know each other. What have they done in Kentucky on this? We heard Kentucky did a good thing, or Louisiana did something on this. We have them talking to each other across states, which is good.
The national assessment, which you praised as the only good test that exists, doesn't very often do content assessments. They do reading and math every 2 years because they're mandated to by Congress. But if you want to see history or civics or science or anything else, you wait 10 years or 12 years or something like that to even get any data. And you never get it at the state level, by the way, on those in those other subjects. Would we do the country more good if that measuring stick, that assessment system, dealt with the content subjects more often, and if it did more release of results at the state level?
Yes, I think so. Though, I hate to tinker with something that's worked for, since 1969? Is that right?
Yeah.
Hard to believe it's that old. You remember who we appointed to chair and co-chair of that?
Well, I remember the study group that we put together to revamp it, and that was Senator Alexander.
And,
it included Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Wife of the governor. That's right.
Yes.
And anyway, yes, the answer is yes, though it's working well. I'd hate to see it start to do more things and not work as well. But there's a problem with the emphasis on reading and math, which I referred to in my talk, and Steiner and Berner talk about it, which because of all the emphasis on reading and math, there's less emphasis on the other content areas. Mm-hmm. So it looks like it's a skill thing. And that's the way a lot of schools are geared toward the skill thing.
We didn't give you time enough to unpack all this, but your paper lays out a sort of 6-part framework for state policy leaders to advance content. And they all made sense to me, but they just turned into a very heavy lift. And I found myself wondering as I read it, and this is unfair to the audience because they haven't read it, but can they do all those things? I mean, if they have to fuss with their teacher standards and their academic standards and their tests and their textbooks and all these other things, are we giving people a realistic assignment, I guess, is what I'm asking you ultimately. Again, back to the state folks.
Well, it took a lot of work in Massachusetts.
Yeah?
A lot of work has gone into Louisiana.
Yeah? So the actual proves the possible.
Yeah, you bet. During some of those great days for Tennessee, right?
Yes.
It's a lot of hard work.
All right.
Keep pushing.
Well, we will. I'm going to open this up now to the studio audience, and thank you again all for coming. We've got some time for questions to Secretary Bennett, and we will begin with him. You got to introduce yourself. You're being recorded or taped or something.
Will do. Thank you. Ross Marchand, Taxpayers Protection Alliance. Thank you so much. It was informative. Education policy is not something that I've read up on a lot, so this was very, very informative. Thank you.
It's easy, actually.
It's easy, yeah, as I learned today. Yeah.
And you can be away for 30 years, and you come back and here at 1986.
Rip Van Winkle.
Dittos.
I wasn't alive then, so.
Yeah, I understand. I know. I was in my prime, though, man.
And you still are.
Thank you.
As a Jersey boy, I've heard reports over the years that Mark Zuckerberg has poured many, many hundreds of millions of dollars into Newark schools. What happened to that money? And broader question, what happens when you have a multitude of private money interacting with the bureaucracy of something like the Newark school system?
It's a great question. Others may want to speak to this. I actually talked to Mark Zuckerberg about that very topic. He wanted to meet me. He said, why don't we meet by video? I said, I didn't think for a minute we were going to actually meet in person. Do you actually exist? But it was fine, except the funny thing was it was at a video conference room down the street, and the tech didn't work. I said, hey, your tech doesn't work. It was kind of reassuring. Even for Zuckerberg, it doesn't work, You bring all the AV stuff into the school, doesn't work, Anyway, it didn't work for Zuckerberg, too. But anyway, we finally had the meeting, and he said, what should I do with this foundation? He asked me and a whole bunch of other people.
His new foundation,
yeah.
Chan Zuckerberg.
And I said, stop throwing it away like you did in Newark. That was a mess. And they've done some good things and some constructive things since. And they've got some good people out there. Who's the guy worked in the Bush administration? We know we had breakfast with. Karen? Who's that guy? Andy Smerrick's one. Who's the guy we had breakfast with?
Blanking,
He's a consultant to Chan Zuckerberg.
Oh, John Bailey.
John Bailey, yeah. And they've done some good things. But this happens a lot when you give the money and you trust the people to get it right instead of having what they call in contracts a lot of receivables, targets you have to hit. I went out to Chicago, I think 5 times as secretary. The reason I went 5 is the first time I went, I said, these are the worst schools in the United States of America.
Well, there's an anecdote that goes with that, too, but we can come back to that. I was the director of research, and you called me into your office, and you said, I just told the Chicago Tribune that Chicago has the worst public schools in America. Was I right?
Make sure it is.
Was I right?
I was pretty close.
I hemmed and hawed as best I can recall and said there might be a little competition from Memphis and St. Louis, but you weren't wrong.
The second time, I know exactly what you said, because the second time I brought it up again, a guy stood up and said, we have done some research, and you said, 50% of our kids drop out of school and 50% score in the bottom 5% of the country, but Detroit is worse. I said, good for you, just Justice Holmes says, "Do not be guilty of low aspirations." Now, it's a laugh line, but it's terrible. Think of the disservice those kids, right? I mean, horrible. Those kids aren't getting educated. And then we went back, and then they said, "We have some really good schools." I said, "Fine, let's go see one." They said, "Give us a little time." It took them a little time. We went to the LaSalle Language Academy. I don't know if you were with me. And it was a school of choice. And Amy Weissneria was the principal. We spent the day at school with the head of the school board. And that was my epiphany. And then we had, other teachers like that we met and principals. I said, this school is great, poor part of town, poor kids, multi-ethnic. Scores were great. Why is it great? And I said, well, first of all, it's a school of choice. Parents send their kids here, but they have to sign up to do certain things, like turn off the TV until homework is done and get them to bed, get them a good breakfast in the morning, or if you don't want to do breakfast, send them here. We'll give them breakfast. But you've got to observe certain rules. I said to the head of the school board, why don't you have this throughout the system, choice? He said, because there are a lot of schools in the system no one would choose if they had the opportunity to. Great. How's that for a Soviet system of education? We got to send them there because if they were free to go, they'd leave. And then there are a couple of other things, like they picked Amy out to run it because she was an entrepreneur and smart and tough and loved the kids. And I said, why don't you find people like this for all your schools? He said, we'd have to fire half our people. And this was part of the epiphany.
This is a trigger warning for people that get Robert Pondicio's book in September.
Right.
You're going to find a lot of similarities with Success Academy in New York City, with the model that you just depicted from LaSalle in Chicago.
Right.
A lot of similarities.
The end of the story, the penultimate part of the story, is that the Chicago Tribune did a series, and every time I have been back in Chicago publicly since then, they always say the man who called our schools the worst. When I die, I know that's what they'll write. Anyway.
Okay, who's next?
But no, let me just say this, because they did a survey of schools, and they found a school with a 100% dropout rate.
Oh.
And the philosopher in me said, do they still do messages or the loudspeakers? Bishop Barclay, tree falls in the forest. Are teachers still getting paid? Yes.
Of course.
Administrators still getting, nobody's there.
No students.
Anyway. But there was that school in Baltimore, profile 5 years ago, where not a single student was reading at grade level.
Right.
Now, when the Secretary of Agriculture, when they had what's the virus you get from bad food, the horrible thing that kills you? What? E. coli. E. coli on the West Coast, Secretary of Agriculture was out there, and they shut down the whole chain. We should shut down that chain, that school, if it's not teaching anybody reading. That's strong-arm federal government, I know.
Back in the corner.
If they're taking federal money, they got to be accountable.
Bill Glacken,
Bill Glacken, Scotty Glacken's brother, St. John's quarterback, Duke.
That's right.
Wow.
Number 17.
I know. He eluded me all night.
I said there were reunion aspects to this today. Go ahead.
This is before you.
It sure is.
Senior year of high school, Gonzaga High School. He was St. John's.
Had a great Jesuit education there. What type of freedom, my first question is, what type of freedom does an individual teacher to have, let's say, read the children's book of virtues? And my second question is,
What kind of freedom?
Say it again.
what type of freedom would an individual teacher have in a school to bring in a book like the children's book of virtues to read? And my second question is, what did you learn from Janis Joplin?
I'll deal with the second one first. I had a blind date with Janis Joplin, which everybody thought was hilarious because I wrote the Book of Virtues. And I wouldn't talk about it because the gentleman doesn't do it, but nothing happened. It was in Texas. I was a graduate student. I was living with a bunch of rowdy undergraduate kids, hippies, long hair, lots of music. But I was taking care of them and trying to herd them in the right direction. And there was a guy who was coming back, and they were celebrating his 50th anniversary in music with all the people he had given a start to in Austin. And Janis Joplin was one. She said, I'll come back if you get me a date. And so they said, will you be your date? I said, sure. And this was long before I met Mrs. Bennett. And
long before.
And Anyway,
There was nowhere to go but up, and you
No.
did.
But it was outside.
I think his first question was better.
And but this is interesting. She sang Bobby McGee for about 20 minutes. No, this is interesting because this is one to tell your kids about being a star. She sat there with me and she said, "Do you have a beer?" I gave her a beer, and she said, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm a graduate student in philosophy." She said, "What's that?" And I said, "A couple things." And she said, "What's your life like?" I said, "I go to the library and I read, I argue with people, talk." I said, "What's your life like?" And she talked about how ugly her life was. She, of course, died of drugs. And she said, I remember she said, "You are very lucky. You are very fortunate." And I thought, boy, these kids should hear this, you know?
Yes.
Anyway, very sad. She was very, very sad, very unhappy even then. How much freedom does a teacher have to teach a children's book of virtues? There are people in this room who know more, better answer that than I. But I'll clip it on to an earlier question. State can lay out mandates. Teach children the meaning of the virtues, honesty, perseverance, compassion. How you do it is up to you, classroom teacher. Freedom, autonomy for the teacher. That's what I'd like. Let the teacher choose the material with recommendations from the district. Make sense?
Is there a current or recent elementary teacher in the room? Raise your hand. Robert, could you take the Book of Virtues into your classroom and nobody would give you any grief? Yes. Well, you had that freedom in your charter school, right?
I would argue that I had too much freedom.
Too much freedom.
I wanted a curriculum.
Uh-huh.
I didn't want that level.
The hope was that the Book of Virtues and the Children's Book of Virtues would go into the schools. Never happened. Went to home schools. Never happened.
Go.
And there's a list of prerequisites by the district. The committee has to sit on it with parents to get a new book on the list. And then on top of that, every community learning team for each grade has to agree on all the same books to teach to your students, unless you're an IB teacher. And the books don't really matter because it's skills-based education.
And if the book isn't on that list, you can't, not allowed to
You are
use
not
it?
allowed to teach it, but you can request that it get on the list for next year and ask the committee to review it.
Ah,
Boy,
okay.
there's a sentence there in the middle of that. The books don't really matter.
You can teach the skills regardless of the content.
Wow.
I lasted 2 years.
Wow.
Next. Yes, sir. Right here. Mike. Familiar face.
Mr. Secretary, my name is Greg Sheckman. I'm with the University of Central Florida. It's a privilege to be here.
UCF.
I serve actually with Luther on the Education Commission of the States as a Marylander. I live in
Everybody,
Maryland.
somebody has to be.
Yes. So my question is, you were talking about the NAEP, but aren't we now benchmarking ourselves against other nations and not necessarily against other states? And so I'm curious to know what you think about the PISA and where we stack up with those kinds of tests.
We don't stack up very well, I don't think, do we?
Well, that was your statistic about Massachusetts being 10th in the world
10th in the
came
world,
from a
right.
PISA
Yeah,
result.
right. Yeah, no, I don't think we do. What's the best one, by the way? Is it PISA or is it OECD or
Well,
what?
OECD is PISA, and that is taken over. I personally a little bit partial to the science and math one, name of which is Tim's. Sorry, but
Right.
that's sort of been eclipsed by the aggressive marketing of the OECD for PISA. But anyway, that's PISA checks 15-year-olds across the board in core subjects. It doesn't look at any other age or grade level, only 15-year-olds. And it's been doing it for 15 or so years, and the U.S. kind of chronically turns up in the lower middle among the countries that are being tested. And what's even more worrying to me is that our best students are nowhere near the top of everybody else's average, not everybody else's, the leading country's average students.
It's long been a concern of
Yes,
yours.
it is.
The,
It should be. Okay.
You going to a bowl this year? Major bowl? You want to play Auburn again?
It's early in the year for that, isn't it?
No, never
No,
too early.
never.
I'm
not to
dying,
talk
man.
about it.
I'm dying. 91 days to
Obsessive.
the season.
Obsessives, Mike Petrilli.
Okay. So, Secretary Bennett, you mentioned Yuval Levin's paper, which was fantastic. And when he gave a talk, what he argued basically was that conservatives, when we teamed up with progressives on things like No Child Left Behind and that whole agenda, that it did some good, but that conservatives also gave up a lot. And in many ways we gave up on talking about things like character and virtue and having some of those culture war fights. And his argument is it might be time again to engage in those fights. I just guess I'm curious from your perspective, the value of, you talked a little bit about this, the value of working together and bipartisanship, trying to get back to that, versus kind of having it out right now. What would you say if we had to choose one direction or the other?
Well, I think the two have to go together, because you're going to fight with the other side, and you come to some kind of compromise. I was never thrilled with No Child Left Behind. I thought the best comment was yours. I remember over the phone, we were talking to the White House. You said you got to have an audit of this, right? You got to have some way of finding out.
Well, it was the sort of heir to the goals that were set.
Goals 2000.
Yeah, and the Charlottesville goals that the governors set. And
Right.
then how do you know whether they're being
Right.
achieved or not? You need a measuring stick, and you need an accountability system.
Right. I don't go to Washington for bipartisanship, but, some states work better than Washington works right now. And, you got to hash these things out. Again, I refer to Checker's rough experience here on the Maryland State Board, but there are some state boards that work better. And, we have a number of our members at Conservative Leaders for Education who are themselves conservatives, Republicans, who say they have not been met with animosity by, the usual governing group, which has been Democrats. Democrats believed and have acted as if they own the education issue. And one of the things we tried to do is encourage conservatives to get in it. But I don't think there's any way to avoid some of the frictions and some of the fights.
There was
They're important. It's too important.
There was a time, I don't know if it can come back, when it was possible to simply agree on some things and agree to disagree on other things and work
That's right.
together on the things you agreed on.
On this international thing, there's tons of statistics and studies, but correct me if I'm wrong, but Hanashek, I think, has pointed out, I was surprised to see, he says, I think we have a pretty good teaching force, but if you got rid of the bottom 5%,
Scores would go up.
we would be 14th in the world, or something. You know what I'm talking
Yes.
about? And the gross national product would double or something, triple.
Well,
Sounds Trumpian, but, big, huge, big.
Huge. You're conflating a couple of different Hanushek studies, but yes, in one study he did say if you laid off the lowest performing 5% of teachers, scores would go up. And in another study he said if we got our levels of achievement up to even that of Canada, the gross domestic product would go up by zillions over the next 50 years. So yes, both of those things.
The other study was that, I think it was done at Milken, was the third graders, 50%, 50th percentile in math and reading. Give that third grader a teacher evaluated by other teachers as excellent. And
Makes a
2 years later, it's the 80th. Give that child a teacher evaluated by other teachers as poor, and he's at the 30th percentile.
Right.
Something like that.
Yes.
Close. Good
we-
teacher makes a huge difference. That elementary school study, I wanted to refer to it
Yes.
quickly. Wrote this down so I don't conflate two studies. Problem with Checker working for me is he was always correcting me, but that's all right. But I deserved it a lot of the time. Less than half of aspiring elementary school teachers pass the most common content test on the first try. Fewer than half. 72% pass after many attempts.
But they get hired anyway.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And if you reduce class size, which does not seem to make much difference, right?
It's made it worse.
You have to dig further down to get teachers, which means less qualified people.
We're running down. We may have time for one or two more.
Yes, ma'am.
Mrs. Bennett.
I have one,
All right.
if I may. I know there are quite a few very important people here who might have questions too, so I'll try to be brief. Talk about great teachers, and we know, and you don't even need a study, truly, to say or tell us, those of us who are in the classroom, and those of us who have children in the classroom, that teachers make the difference. There's a movement now, and it's gaining, I think, tread, to replace teachers with iPads, particularly for low-income students. We've just seen this in North Carolina. And give the lowest income students their own iPad starting in the kindergarten. I'd like you to comment on that. 3 hours a day on the iPad. I think there's an an elephant in the room here, and I think it has to do with cyber education and the iPhone and the iPad and the amount of time students now are locked in to digital learning. And we're wondering, what's going to happen to the great teachers? Thank you.
My initial answer, I'm not a Luddite. I don't want to smash these machines, and I think there are some advantages, and I use it to get lots of information, facts. But I sure don't like the sound of that. Like a living, breathing human being who, cares about the kids, actually makes it plain that she wants to help them learn, develop their wit and character, makes a difference. Plus, there's that story about the teacher who was stopped coming, and he sent his lectures on tape. And he with a big tape recorder, he went into the classroom 3 weeks later and found his big tape recorder and 20 little tape recorders. Well, the hell with it, and then you find out at the elite universities half of the instruction, right, is not in person. It seems to me the most important in-person education is the earliest, less as you go on. It's an oddity about education. The more influence you have on a person's life, the less you get paid. Kindergarten teachers get paid less than graduate school instructors. And graduate school instruction is one-on-one, I don't like the sound of that. Though I think we should take advantage of their confidence and ability with this technology to teach them some stuff. It's like when I'm trying to figure out the TV. Is there a 14-year-old around? Isn't there?
We have 3 remotes at home now, and I can barely keep up. But
what do you say to that?
Well, I'm going to slightly disagree with Elaine, or with the implication of it. The studies that I've seen suggest that pure virtual learning doesn't do anybody much good if you just strap a kid to a screen and expect him to learn. Sophisticated combination of a teacher and technology can allow for an individualization and a progress at your own rate that is very difficult for a teacher to do with 27 kids in the room. So kids can move at different speeds through their material with the teacher kind of supervising and helping, coaching, coaxing. The technology is not substituting for the teacher, but it's amplifying the teacher, in my opinion.
I thought the assumption of the question is teachers not to be seen in the
Well,
room.
if that's the...
I'm sorry, didn't mean that. Obviously, there's got to be an adult in the room.
Okay.
But we were talking about the qualities of a great teacher.
Yeah.
But absolutely, Checker, a great teacher would utilize an iPad to enhance his or her teaching.
Right, like they would have...
Students' ability to learn.
Like they would once have used an encyclopedia or dictionary. And so it was in effect, go look it up. That's a really interesting question. Well,
Up on your iPad.
yeah. There are ways you can amplify the teacher, not substitute for the teacher. I guess that's how I deal with it.
When did The Educated Child come out?
88, I thought. You got it. Thought it was after we were at the Department of Education.
80, oh,
So it was after 88.
I thought it was 90.
It was after 88.
I thought it was 90, 91.
Yeah.
But anyway, we
We were
spent a
out.
lot of time on this, you,
Yes.
Crib and I,
Yes.
on the role of technology in the
Yes.
classroom, which was then mostly calculators we were talking about.
Yes.
And we said, thumbs down. Now,
Yes.
now we have to do that today. What would we say?
We'd say it's going to be there, so how are you using it is now, I think, the question.
Yeah.
And if you're using it as a substitute for a competent teacher, that's a mistake. If you're using it to amplify a good teacher, it's an asset. But that's a subtle thing to get right. And I'm not going to suggest that that's easy to do. We've got maybe one more, and then we're done.
But
In
then
the
just
front-
think about artificial intelligence and robots, too. They're coming, right?
Young lady in the front row, you're it. You're the end.
Yes, my name is Brianna Nave. I'm an intern at Center for Education Reform. I'm actually a current educational studies major. So I wanted to know what are some courses that you would implement into the collegiate curriculum in order to enhance effective teachers?
Into the college curriculum?
Yes.
For teachers?
Yes, because I'm also taking my certification test currently. So I just wanted to know some courses that I could take after my collegiate experience to get my graduate degree in order to become an effective teacher?
I'm not expert on this, so I'll defer to Checker or anyone else in the room. But I would say, given that Massachusetts experience, given that elementary teacher school experience, and my own experience, I would emphasize subject matter knowledge more in whatever subject. There's the Teach for America experience, which I translate as a lot of people who majored in chemistry now can go into school and teach chemistry. That's an original idea. And so this very competitive program. Subject matter knowledge is, I think, the thing most missing. But others will have to answer whether the standard course of instruction in the School of Ed on pedagogy, presentation, curriculum design, whether it's worth it or not. I have no idea.
What level of teaching do you hope to do? What level of early childhood? Okay. I mean, you do need some pedagogy and some child psychology and child development. There's no doubt about that. But if that's 80% of the curriculum, then you are missing out on the ways in which kids, for example, end up learning to read, which is all of the things you do in early childhood that prepare you for the kindergarten and first grade courses in which you actually do read. There's not to mention the great stories that will get kids interested in content, because 4-year-olds love stories. And if you tell them a story about a hero as opposed to a villain, or maybe they need both.
Yeah, it's still magic, even in technology, robots, AI. There's still magic with kids. Try it. You say, once upon a time.
Yeah.
And if you can follow through with the next couple sentences, it still works.
So see if you can find a
And tell me again. Tell me again. Tell me that story again.
Once upon a time, there were courses that did things like that.
Good.
We are concluded. We are concluded with 10 sessions and today's session, and I want to thank you again for a wonderful, wonderful time together.
Thank you. Did I answer the question?
Your paper does a very good job of answering the question, and your talk answers about 2/3 of it.
Still my toughest grader.